30 royals, 30 uniforms. One question: when a crown meets combat, what survives, duty or legacy? From ancient empires to modern airstrikes, these rulers didn't just pose in medals, they led, bled, commanded, and risked everything. Some fought for glory, some for country, a few for redemption. But behind every polished boot and polished lie, there's a battlefield memory no crown can erase. This isn't royalty as you know it, this is war by bloodline. And it's time to meet the monarchs who traded thrones for front lines. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed for more long-form dives into the strange lives of history's most powerful people who actually did the job. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it on your end? Midnight in Manila, 3 a.m. in Ohio. We're building a global campfire of curious minds. Pull up a chair. 1. Alexander the Great, King of Macedon. By the time Alexander was 20, he'd inherited a kingdom, tamed a mutinous nobility, crushed his rivals, and burned a rebellious city to the ground. But that was just his warm-up act. For a man trained by Aristotle and tempered by the paranoid genius of his father, Philip II, ruling Macedonia wasn't the goal. It was just the launch pad. What Alexander really wanted, what he really believed, was that he was born to conquer the world, and for a while it looked like he just might. The curious thing about Alexander, beyond the mythology and the marble busts, is that he wasn't some distant robed commander dictating strategy from a shaded tent. No, he was in the mud, on horseback, bleeding. He fought at the front, sometimes so recklessly that his own generals accused him of having a death wish. At the Battle of the Granicus, he led the charge across a river directly into a wall of Persian cavalry. At Issus, he turned a near defeat into a tactical trap, personally striking down the Persian commander. At Gaugamela, his magnum opus, he cracked an army more than twice his size by punching straight through to King Darius himself. The Persians broke. Darius ran, Alexander didn't. This wasn't just military genius, it was theatre, and Alexander understood theatre. After defeating the Persians, he didn't just claim their throne, he dressed like them, married into their nobility, made their gods his own. His army hated it, his friends feared it. But to Alexander, merging worlds wasn't treason, it was strategy. He believed he wasn't just conquering territory, he was unifying humanity under him. Of course, his campaigns didn't march, they devoured. From the shores of the Aegean to the edge of the Indus River, he carved a path of blood, ambition, and philosophical justification. Every city taken was a step towards some imagined destiny, some cosmic choreography in which Alexander was both the blade and the hand that wielded it. But cracks, as they always do, began to show. His men, after a decade of endless marching, finally balked in India. What else is left, they asked. They were tired of glory, tired of dying in the name of someone else's divine inheritance. Alexander sulked, raged, sulked again, and then turned back. He would never reach China, never see Rome rise, never find what he was looking for. He died in Babylon at 32. No final victory, no climactic duel, just fever, weakness, and silence. His body was preserved in honey. His empire was immediately sliced apart. His legacy, however, fermented. Because here's the twist: Alexander the Great, the so-called greatest military mind in history, left behind almost nothing that endured. No stable system, no clear successor, no ruling dynasty. His greatness was immediate but unstable, like a lightning strike, bright, loud, and gone before you process what just happened. And yet, every conqueror that followed, Caesar, Napoleon, even modern generals, invoked his name like a spell, as if saying it would imbue them with his myth, as if greatness could be borrowed. But what Alexander proved is that you can be the sword, the king and the storm, and still leave behind a map of ash. His battlefield brilliance was real, his charisma nuclear, his belief in a unified world oddly utopian. But when you lead from the front, you often die there, and Alexander, for all his genius, never figured out what to do after winning. Of course, that didn't stop others from trying to emulate him, like the one who followed, a king who traded philosophy for piety, armor for chainmail, and swapped the dream of one world under Greece for one city under God. 2. Richard IV's the Lionheart, King of England. They called him the Lionheart, but he preferred to think of himself as a professional disappointment. To his father, certainly. To his kingdom, possibly. To the idea of peace, absolutely. Richard Plantagenet, King of England, was the sort of man who treated warfare not as a burden of rule, but as a form of self-expression. While other monarchs stayed home to manage courts, he sailed off to fight in deserts he'd never seen, for causes he only half understood. And the world, being starved for spectacle, loved him for it. He wasn't even really English, not in spirit. He was raised in Aquitaine, spoke French, wrote poetry, and spent only a few months of his 10-year reign actually in England. To his subjects, he was more myth than monarch, an expensive myth at that, one who financed his holy wars by draining the treasury and pawning off everything not nailed down, including official titles and, allegedly, the city of London itself. But to Richard it was all justified, because somewhere in the dust of the Holy Land he'd find the eternal prize, Jerusalem. When Richard arrived for the Third Crusade in 1191, the campaign was already teetering between idealism and exhaustion. The previous crusades had devolved into blood feuds and bankruptcies, but Richard brought a sense of theatre that reignited the whole enterprise. His rival was Saladin, cultured, intelligent, and far less interested in theatrics. Their contest became something larger than war. It was the collision of two narratives, each convinced it represented divine will. On the field, Richard was terrifyingly competent. He was 6 feet tall, huge for his era, and known to fight in the front ranks wearing a crown over his helmet, as if to remind everyone, friend or foe, exactly who was leading. He smashed the Saracen army at Arsuf, fought through ambushes, and personally led charges that should have killed him. When he wasn't fighting, he negotiated, ruthlessly. Saladin respected him, feared him even. The two men never met in person, but their rivalry became legend. Mutual admiration filtered through the smoke of holy war. But there's a fine line between devotion and obsession, and Richard crossed it often. Jerusalem was always out of reach, either by treaty or exhaustion or sheer logistics. His men begged him to stop, to go home, to remember that kingship required a kingdom. Richard refused. He wanted glory, not governance. The kind of glory that didn't need witnesses, only songs. Eventually, he settled for a truce. Saladin kept Jerusalem. Richard kept his legend. It was a strangely civilized ending for a man whose name had become synonymous with crusade. On his way home, he was shipwrecked, captured, and held for ransom by the Duke of Austria. England was bled dry once again to pay for his release. He returned home briefly, scowling at paperwork, feuding with his brother John, then promptly went back to fighting, this time in France. And that's where his story ends, not in Jerusalem, but outside a small French castle hit by a crossbow bolt during a petty siege. He lingered for days, cursing fate, forgiving his killer, and dying in his mother's arms. A lion brought down by a spark. Yet, like Alexander before him, Richard's real empire was psychological. His legend outlived his achievements, his failures forgotten under the roar of his name. Even centuries later, novelists and monarchists would resurrect him as the ideal medieval king. Brave, noble, devout, romantic. The reality was messier, a soldier who confused valor for virtue and war for worship. He proved that a king could be admired for fighting more than for ruling. And that perhaps was the beginning of England's long love affair with military monarchs. The idea that the sword validated the crown, and if Alexander fought for empire and Richard for faith, then the next royal would fight for something quieter, lonelier, and far more human. The burden of duty when the world is burning. And while Richard's riding off into another holy war, quick pause. If you're still here, 2 kings in, you're clearly one of us. So hit that subscribe button and join the growing crew that actually likes their history with a little edge. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time is it for you? I know some of you are watching this at 2 a.m. with headphones on like it's state secrets. Respect. 5. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, United Kingdom. Before scandal hardened the public's opinion and headlines buried his reputation beneath layers of controversy, Prince Andrew was, at one point in time, simply a naval aviator, a young man in uniform, a prince with something to prove, not to the tabloids, not to the crown, but to the small crew flying beside him in a helicopter over a battlefield. Few people in Britain truly understood. The year was 1982, and the Falklands War had just erupted. An obscure chain of windswept islands in the South Atlantic suddenly became the centre of British foreign policy, military logistics, and national pride. For Argentina, it was a matter of reclaiming territory. For Britain, it was about defending overseas sovereignty. For Prince Andrew, then 22 years old and freshly trained as a Royal Navy helicopter pilot, it was a test of everything he'd trained for and everything he'd been born into. He had joined the Royal Navy in 1979 and quickly earned his wings. By the time the Falklands conflict began, he was already flying Sea King helicopters with 820 Naval Air Squadron stationed aboard the aircraft carrier HMS Invincible. This wasn't ceremonial. This wasn't a photo op. It was live combat. His job, search and rescue, anti-submarine warfare, transport. It sounds clinical, logistics in the sky, but it involved flying into low-visibility zones, often under threat from enemy aircraft or missiles, to retrieve the wounded, supply frontline troops, or deploy commandos. There were no guarantees in the air, especially not with the Argentine Exocet missiles haunting the fleet and British ships being sunk within view of the task force. At one point, his helicopter was involved in decoy missions, flying patterns intended to lure enemy missiles away from higher value targets. In essence, bait. Whether that particular task ever came to the edge of tragedy remains classified or unverified, but the psychological weight of it is undeniable. Even as a prince, he was not immune to risk. He wasn't placed in a palace-branded hovercraft and whisked to safety. He did the job. Those who served with him later described him as competent, confident, and well integrated with his squadron. There are no reports of royal heirs. Just a pilot doing his rotations, preparing for what the mission required. After the war, he returned home to a wave of public admiration. A royal who had been to war. It struck a nerve with the public, reminded them of an older image of monarchy, the kind that didn't just appear at ceremonies, but stood watch when the weather turned violent. He remained in the Navy for over 2 decades, reaching the rank of commander. He would go on to represent military charities, attend naval functions, and keep close ties with the services long after his active duty ended. But the Falklands would remain the sharpest moment of clarity when the pomp of royalty was peeled away by the rotor blades and salt spray of a very real, very unforgiving battlefield. Years later, whatever would come to define Prince Andrew in the media, in courtrooms, or in public opinion would not change what happened in 1982. He flew, he served, he followed orders. And for a brief moment, the title of prince was quieted by something heavier. The rank of lieutenant, Sea King pilot, war veteran. Because the next royal too would chase a purpose from the air, but in a different kind of war, in a different kind of desert, under the scorching sun of a new century where the enemies were invisible and the threats never seemed to end. 4. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, United Kingdom. Before he became the Queen's consort, or the walking embodiment of British upper-class bluntness, Prince Philip was something much simpler and far more dangerous, a naval officer in a world at war. Born into Greek royalty and exiled before he could walk, Philip's childhood was a passport of instability. Germany, France, England, back to Germany, then finally Britain again. He was stateless, penniless, and largely familyless. His father vanished into a quiet Mediterranean retirement, his mother into a religious order. The aristocratic surname, if it even counted, meant little. What Philip had, instead, was an education carved out of steel, Gordonstoun School, which specialized in cold showers, mountain hikes, and the theory that character was forged mostly through discomfort. It worked. He emerged lean, competitive, and fluent in not complaining. A useful skill for what came next. In 1939, with Europe on the brink, Philip joined the Royal Navy as a cadet. By the time he graduated from Dartmouth, war had already begun. At just 18, he was thrust into the largest military conflict the world had ever known. And unlike many royals who served in ceremonial uniforms from a safe distance, Philip's posting was real. He trained on HMS Ramillies, escorting convoys through the Indian Ocean, where German raiders lurked and neutrality was a myth. But it was in the Mediterranean that his record hardened into something more than noble obligation. Serving on the battleship HMS Valiant, Philip saw action at the Battle of Cape Matapan in 1941, a naval engagement against the Italian fleet off the coast of Greece. He was just 19, but already showing signs of his cool precision under pressure. Assigned to control the ship's searchlights, he coordinated a sudden flare that exposed enemy vessels in the dead of night. The result? Devastating salvos. Several Italian ships were destroyed. Philip was mentioned in dispatches, a formal recognition of gallantry or merit. It was not handed out lightly. He climbed the ranks quickly, sub-lieutenant, then lieutenant. He served on destroyers, was present at the Allied invasion of Sicily, and later took part in escorting operations for the Pacific Fleet. In 1945, as the war ended, he was aboard HMS Whelp in Tokyo Bay. When the Japanese surrender was signed, he had gone from exile to witness of empire in 6 years flat, and all of it on active duty. But the war wasn't just a proving ground, it was a crucible. It gave him what his fractured childhood never had, a sense of place, merit earned, not inherited. And perhaps that's why, when he returned to civilian life and into the orbit of Princess Elizabeth, he struggled to adjust. Court life was structured, silent, decorative. The man who had once commanded men in combat was suddenly a consort, a royal accessory, expected to smile politely behind the throne. He did, mostly, but that fire never left him. In quiet moments, he spoke about the war, not with flair, but with clarity. The mess, the responsibility, the absurdity of luck. He remained deeply connected to the armed forces for the rest of his life, holding ceremonial posts, but speaking as someone who had actually worn the uniform, actually heard the alarms, actually watched the horizon for things that could kill. And when he walked behind his wife at state functions, or in front of the cameras as the blunt, often controversial figure the public knew, there was always that unseen weight behind him, not of royalty, but of service. The next royal would also take to the skies, not with medals already engraved, but with a rotor blade spinning over cold South Atlantic waters, heading straight into war and into the eye of a nation's political reckoning. 3. George VI, King of the United Kingdom. Before he was a king, he was just Bertie. Shy, stammering, awkwardly noble Bertie, second son of George V, never meant to rule. He didn't want a crown. What he wanted, honestly, was to be useful, to earn something on his own, away from the gold-plated machinery of monarchy. That's how, in 1916, as Europe collapsed into mechanized madness, Prince Albert, Duke of York, volunteered for active duty, not as a symbol, as a sailor. He entered the Royal Navy as a midshipman, serving aboard the HMS Collingwood, a battleship large enough to intimidate, slow enough to remind its crew that they were essentially floating targets. Bertie didn't ask for special treatment. His messmates, most of them unaware of his title, called him Mr. Johnson for the sake of formality, but his station was real. He stood watch, learned gunnery, cleaned equipment, and followed orders. Then came Jutland. The Battle of Jutland, fought in 1916, was the largest naval engagement of World War I. Imagine over 250 ships and nearly 100,000 men spread across the cold North Sea, each side trying to bait the other into making a fatal mistake. Bertie was there, young, seasick, and wedged between turrets on a ship trading heavy artillery with the German High Seas Fleet. It's unclear if he fired a shot. What is clear is that he saw death, heard it, felt the metal of war peel back the illusion of honor and reveal something colder underneath. Jutland wasn't a victory, but it wasn't quite a defeat either. Much like Bertie himself, the battle just endured, uncelebrated but necessary. After the war, he transferred to the Royal Air Force, the newest and most romantic branch of service. He learned to fly, earned his wings, and carried on with a quiet sense of obligation. His war record wouldn't make headlines. There were no dramatic crusades, no sweeping charges, no medals pinned in triumphant parades. But for Bertie, service wasn't a performance. It was preparation for something far worse than war, responsibility. Because years later, after his older brother Edward VIII abdicated the throne in pursuit of personal freedom, Bertie, now George VI, was dragged into a position he never wanted. He didn't walk into the coronation like a conqueror. He stepped into it like a man heading into another storm. And then World War II began. George VI became the reluctant wartime king. He refused to leave London during the Blitz, choosing instead to remain at Buckingham Palace even after it was bombed. He visited bombed-out neighborhoods, hospitals, munitions factories, not to give speeches, but simply to show up, to be seen, to reassure, to remind people that leadership wasn't always about charisma. Sometimes it was about constancy. His military service wasn't a chapter, it was a foundation. It taught him discipline, timing, humility, and how to function inside chaos without letting it define him. It made him credible in war, because he had already stood watch in one, not as a figurehead, but as a frightened young man who had once stared into a gun barrel at sea and not flinched. His voice, so often mocked for its stutter, became a kind of national metronome during the war. Halting, human, real. He never sounded like a conqueror, but that was the point. He sounded like the people he served. And after the victory, when the bombs stopped falling and the royal image had been burnished not by conquest but by endurance, George VI quietly faded into post-war history. He died young, tired, smoked out and overburdened, but not forgotten, because his reign reminded the world that military service, when stripped of glory and spectacle, reveals a quieter strength. The courage to remain when leaving is easier. The next royal knew that kind of service too. A prince who didn't just witness war, but steered ships through it, stood amid naval fire, and earned his honours the hard way. 12. Philippe, King of the Belgians. In a nation where the monarchy is perpetually walking the line between formality and fragmentation, King Philippe stands as a quiet symbol of unity. Belgium, after all, is not so much a country as it is a balancing act between Flemish and Walloon, urban and rural, monarchy and republic. And in that balancing act, Philippe's military service offers something rare for a modern royal: real weight, real grit, and real training across air, land, and sea. Born in 1960 to King Albert II and Queen Paola, Philippe was never the most naturally commanding presence. Reserved, serious, and sometimes awkward in public, he was not the kind of heir who charmed headlines or played to crowds. But behind that calm, often unreadable demeanor was a man being methodically prepared not just to wear a crown, but to earn it. And in Belgium, that meant starting with a parachute. Philippe began his military training at the Royal Military Academy in Brussels in 1978, enrolling in the 118th All-Weapons class. Unlike the lighter-touch ceremonial routes taken by some royals elsewhere, this academy is the real deal, Belgium's premier officer training institution. There, cadets are not groomed for cameras, but for combat leadership. Philippe was trained alongside regular officer candidates, with no special royal shortcuts. The days were long, the expectations high, and the scrutiny constant. He didn't just survive the program, he thrived in it. After graduating, Philippe completed paratrooper training with Belgium's elite airborne forces. He earned his wings by jumping from real aircraft, not metaphorical ones. He also completed commando training, a notoriously tough regimen that tests physical endurance, mental resilience, and tactical skill. It's designed to weed out the privileged from the prepared. Philippe passed. He became a certified paratrooper and commando, a badge of honor in a country where the military, though small, prides itself on elite professionalism. And then came the Air Force. Never one to settle, Philippe pursued additional training as a fighter pilot. He didn't just take orientation flights, he trained in cockpit systems, flight theory, and logged hours in fighter jets, eventually qualifying to fly Belgian military aircraft. Few modern monarchs can claim that level of cross-branch immersion. Philippe wasn't just checking boxes, he was building a military resume far broader than required for symbolic leadership. His service continued in the reserves, where he climbed the ranks and stayed involved in national defense policy and military affairs. In 2010, he was promoted to general in the land component, the air component, and the medical component, and to admiral in the naval component. In other words, he didn't just represent the Belgian armed forces, he became their highest-ranking officer. What's striking is how little showmanship Philippe brings to it all. He rarely draws attention to his military past. There are no boastful interviews, no overemphasized anecdotes, but when he visits troops, speaks at remembrance events, or meets with NATO counterparts, you can see it in his posture, the bearing of someone who slept on barracks beds, worn a rucksack, jumped out of planes. His military experience didn't turn him into a celebrity. It turned him into a soldier king in the truest sense, quiet, prepared, and shaped by discipline. And the next royal on our path, he didn't just earn ranks, he commanded warriors in real combat, reshaped elite units from the inside, and made military leadership not just part of his title, but the very thing that defines his rule. 11. Willem-Alexander, King of the Netherlands. If you ever find yourself imagining a European monarch at sea, manning a frigate, working through navigational charts while the North Sea slaps against steel hulls, your mind probably doesn't leap to the Netherlands. Canals, yes. Bicycles, absolutely. But warships, less so. And yet, that's exactly where King Willem-Alexander began forging his credibility. On deck, in uniform, learning what it meant to serve when no one expected him to. Born in 1967 to then Princess Beatrix and Prince Klaus, Willem-Alexander was raised under the soft but very present shadow of post-war constitutionalism. Dutch royalty, since the 20th century, has operated on a tightrope, loved by tradition, bound by law, and constantly at risk of becoming too remote or too performative, which meant that any future monarch would need more than ceremony. He would need substance. Willem-Alexander, to his credit, pursued it. He attended the Royal Netherlands Naval College, known locally as the Koninklijk Instituut voor de Marine, in Den Helder, where naval officers are not just trained but shaped. There he underwent full military training and qualified as an officer in the Royal Netherlands Navy. This wasn't a token semester with staged photographs. It was a serious course of instruction with live navigation, technical coursework, seamanship, and the same physical demands placed on every other cadet. He served aboard multiple vessels, including frigates, taking part in standard operational deployments, drills, and naval exercises in the Atlantic. It's worth noting, the North Sea doesn't care about your royal blood. It cares whether or not you can steer, follow orders, and hold your own when the ship starts rolling at 20 degrees under a grey sky. Willem Alexander didn't just hold his own, he reportedly thrived. He developed a reputation for being engaged, curious, and unafraid of getting his boots wet. In 1987, he took on further military responsibilities, including officer roles in the Air Force and Army Reserves, eventually earning the rank of Brigadier General, Air Force and Army, and Commodore and Navy. But his early years in the Navy remained his most formative. There, in the confined quarters of a frigate, stripped of title and surrounded by crew who cared far more about competence than courtesy, he learned the quiet discipline of service. Later in life, long before ascending the throne in 2013, Willem Alexander would speak openly about the lessons the Navy taught him about teamwork, leadership, responsibility. Not in the abstract, but in real-world terms, making decisions under pressure, staying calm during mechanical failures, and knowing how to lead without drama. He also maintained an active military connection, including classified exercises with Dutch armed forces even while Crown Prince. Occasionally, he'd be seen flying military aircraft or visiting forward units under minimal press. And while he eventually became known as the Flying King for his commercial pilot credentials, it's his naval background that underpinned his professional demeanor, firm, understated, precise. In a country where monarchy relies not on grandeur but on grounded public service, Willem Alexander's military past isn't ornamental, it's foundational. He didn't need to serve, but he did, quietly, competently, and completely. And the next royal, he didn't just train for war, he trained to fall from the sky, march through mud, and lead elite soldiers not by command, but by example. In his case, royalty didn't make the uniform fit better, it made it heavier. 10. Philippe VI, King of Spain. If royal service is often a balancing act between symbolism and substance, then Felipe VI learned early that there was no room for pretense, not in the Spain he would one day inherit. A constitutional monarchy still healing from dictatorship, a fractured national identity, a monarchy under scrutiny, Felipe's future was never going to be a pageant. It was going to be a test, and like all good soldiers, he prepared. Born in 1968, Felipe was groomed not just for royalty, but for credibility. His father, King Juan Carlos III, had walked the razor-thin line between legacy and reform, helping transition Spain from Franco's regime to democratic constitutionalism. The crown had survived, barely, and Felipe, as heir, would have to earn his place in a country still skeptical of thrones. So he trained, not in name only, and not for show. In 1985, at the age of 17, he entered Spain's 3 military academies, one after the other, completing training with the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. This wasn't an honorary lap, it was a multi-year commitment, physically and intellectually grueling, designed to produce an officer who understood not just tactics, but the culture of command across all branches. He graduated as a lieutenant in the Army, an ensign in the Navy, and a lieutenant in the Air Force. And it wasn't just the ranks. He earned his wings, both as a fixed-wing and helicopter pilot. He conducted parachute training with the elite Brigada Paracaidista, one of Spain's most demanding airborne units. He sailed aboard the Juan Sebastián de Elcano, Spain's tall training ship, learning navigation and seamanship the old-fashioned way, by stars and compass, not ceremony. What emerged from this tri-service education wasn't just a royal with military stripes, It was a future king with institutional fluency. Felipe understood the rhythm of the military, not as a guest, but as a participant. He learned the value of chain of command, the gravity of giving orders, and the responsibility that comes with wearing a uniform that others die in. And when his military career transitioned into royal duties, those lessons followed him. He remained active in the armed forces as a reserve officer, eventually holding the highest military rank in all three branches, Captain General, once he ascended the throne in 2014. But unlike in some monarchies, where these titles are decorative, in Spain they carry political weight. The king is, by constitutional design, the commander-in-chief. In moments of national crisis, the king stands between the elected government and the legacy of military power. Felipe has always understood that balancing act. He's walked tightropes during Catalonia's independence crisis, during political deadlocks, during the quiet erosion of public trust in the monarchy. Through it all, his military bearing has remained calm, measured, focused. For Felipe, military service wasn't about the glory of war. It was about institutional discipline, national unity, and preparing for the burden of a crown that in Spain could still slip. And next comes a royal from a different kingdom, born not into ancient tradition, but into a modern monarchy that stands on the water's edge, practical and precise. He too trained on ships, but not to preserve legacy, to become it. 9. Harald V, King of Norway. For a man born into exile and raised in the shadow of Nazi occupation, Harald V's relationship with military service was never just ceremonial, it was existential. His entire childhood was framed by the consequences of invasion. His father, Crown Prince Olav, became the face of Norwegian resistance during World War II, while Harald, just 3 years old, was whisked across the Atlantic to the safety of Washington, D.C., where he spent much of the war in quiet anonymity. And while most royal children remember their first palaces, Harold remembered sirens, embassies, and the unfamiliar accents of American soldiers. When the war ended, Norway rebuilt itself, slowly, carefully, and under the gaze of a monarchy that had remained defiant in exile. The royal family returned to a country not in need of figureheads, but of stability. And for Harold, that meant stepping into a role that was more than symbolic. It meant becoming a soldier. He enrolled in the Norwegian Military Academy and completed his officer training, graduating in 1959. He then served in the Norwegian Army and later in the Navy, following a path that emphasized not just royal duty, but operational competence. He trained in navigation, logistics, and strategy, with a specific emphasis on command. Unlike other European monarchs who sometimes walked the line between tradition and theatre, Harold's service was taken seriously, and not only because of his title. Norway, with its strategic geography and long coastline bordering the Soviet Union during the Cold War, didn't afford the luxury of ornamental defense. Every officer mattered, and Harold took that personally. He understood that in a country where national service is a rite of passage, the role of a monarch, even a future one, had to include real engagement with the military. Not just in dress uniforms at parades, but in the trenches of policy, planning, and readiness. His naval career included active sailing missions, joint exercises, and a deep familiarity with coastal defense operations. He trained extensively in Arctic conditions, because in Norway that's not theoretical. The country's northern territories, remote and weather-beaten, require soldiers who understand that the environment itself can be an adversary. Harold earned that respect. He didn't play soldier, he became one. As he rose in the line of succession, his role evolved. He became a reserve officer, but remained deeply involved in Norway's defense affairs. When he eventually became king in 1991, his military background wasn't trotted out as PR. It was foundational. His relationship with the armed forces was built not on nostalgia, but on shared experience. In his public life, he often speaks quietly, cautiously, but when addressing the military, there's an edge, and authority. He understands the rhythm of command, the loneliness of leadership, and the cultural weight of service in a country that demands a lot from its conscripts. Harold V's legacy is one of steadiness, not flashy, not headline chasing, but rooted. He's a monarch shaped by conflict, matured by service, and defined by the understated competence that comes from knowing what a uniform actually means. And the next royal, he trained in the skies, commanded across 3 branches, and now carries the weight of tradition in a country where military readiness isn't just a formality, it's baked into the very fabric of the monarchy. 8. Prince William, Prince of Wales, United Kingdom. He could have taken the easy route. In fact, most people expected him to. As the eldest son of the future king and the late Princess Diana, Prince William could have easily limited his military experience to ceremonial parades, crisp salutes, and harmless public appearances in uniform. Instead, he chose something messier, less glamorous, more dangerous, and oddly intimate. He became a search and rescue pilot. William's military path began in 2006 when he enrolled at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. Like his brother Harry before him, he completed the grueling officer training course and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Blues and Royals. But while Harry gravitated toward frontline army service, William's journey bent skyward. He transferred to the Royal Air Force, qualified as a pilot in 2008, and then pushed for something highly unusual. He wanted to fly helicopters for real, not just for ceremonial duties. And not in war zones either, but in emergencies, in crises, in chaos. So he joined RAF Search and Rescue Force, specifically No. 22 Squadron, training as a Sea King pilot based at RAF Valley in Anglesey, Wales. It was the kind of role that demanded both technical precision and emotional resilience. He wasn't flying over polished city skylines. His missions took him into the teeth of British weather, out to sea, over cliffs, mountains and forests, usually in the dead of night, or through unrelenting wind. The calls were never glamorous. People were stranded, injured, dying, lost. For nearly 3 years, from 2010 to 2013, Flight Lieutenant Wales, as he was known on duty, responded to real-life emergencies. His crew would scramble at odd hours, fly through ice and fog, and lower winchmen onto fragile surfaces to pluck people from the edge of death. There was no press, no fanfare, and that seemed to be the point. William was there not to be seen, but to be useful. One of his more widely acknowledged rescues involved airlifting a heart attack victim from an oil rig. In another, he helped locate and recover 2 stranded teenagers from a mountain in Snowdonia. He later admitted that some calls haunted him, situations where they were too late or where trauma lingered long after the rotor blades stopped spinning. He wasn't playing hero, he was absorbing the quiet, often tragic burden of trying to keep people alive. Colleagues described him as steady, capable, and fully part of the crew. Not a royal exception, but a working officer who pulled his weight and knew his gear. When he left the military in 2013, he didn't go directly into palace duties. He pivoted instead to another emergency role, this time as an air ambulance pilot for the East Anglian Air Ambulance. Again, real missions, real injuries, real people. William's military service wasn't about strategy or battle, it was about proximity, to danger, to suffering, to the fragile line between life and death. It gave him, in his own words, a kind of perspective that no royal tour or diplomatic meeting ever could. And perhaps in a family shaped by pageantry, that kind of work, raw, real, untelevised, was his quiet rebellion. His way of stepping into duty, not with a sword, but with a stretcher. But duty wears many uniforms, and service isn't always about saving lives. Sometimes it's about preparing for the day you might be forced to take one. And the next royal knew that balance intimately, born a king, trained in war, and shaped by a country where survival wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. 7. King Charles III, United Kingdom. Before the crown, before the inked tabloids and eternal comparisons to his mother, before the slow-burning decades of airship and public reinvention, Charles Philip Arthur George was a naval officer with salt in his hair and something to prove. Not to the nation, he'd spent most of his life doing that, but to himself, because service for Charles was never just ceremonial, it was almost religious, a kind of pilgrimage away from palaces and into something resembling reality. He joined the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy in the early 1970s, as expected for a royal of his generation. But Charles didn't take the fast lane. In fact, the story of his military career is surprisingly straightforward. He trained, he passed, he showed up. He flew, sailed, navigated, and eventually took command. First came flight training with the RAF at Cranwell, where he qualified as a pilot. After earning his wings, he switched uniforms and moved to the Royal Navy, following in the footsteps of his father, Prince Philip. He trained on the HMS Norfolk, a guided missile destroyer, and later served on other ships, including the Minerva and Jupiter. He qualified as a helicopter pilot in 1974, operating from the aircraft carrier HMS Hermes, the same vessel that would later play a major role in the Falklands War. But Charles didn't stop there. In 1976, he was given command of a coastal minesweeper, HMS Bronington. It was a relatively small ship, but the command was real. He wasn't just a royal mascot stationed on the bridge for PR purposes. He was in charge, responsible for the crew, the vessel, the missions. It was, by all accounts, one of the most content chapters of his adult life. The structure, the hierarchy, the clarity of service. It all suited a man who had spent his formative years navigating a maze of royal expectations, public scrutiny, and private contradictions. He left active service that same year after 5 years across air and sea. Not a career sailor, no, but a legitimate officer. One who trained hard, showed competence, and earned respect. And perhaps most importantly, one who remembered, because Charles never fully shed the lessons of his military days. Decades later, his speeches to armed forces veterans carry a tone most political addresses lack. Detail. He speaks of regiments not just by name, but by tradition. He references squadrons and ships like someone who actually served on them, which of course he did. His connection to the military would continue symbolically for years. Colonel-in-Chief titles, ceremonial uniforms, battlefield visits. But it's those early days, flying above the North Sea, patrolling cold waters, balancing royal destiny with naval discipline, that root his military past in something authentic. And unlike some royals whose service was brief or purely symbolic, Charles's was formative. It gave him time outside the palace bubble, time to follow orders instead of issuing them, time to listen, observe, lead. That experience of navigating unpredictable waters, literally and metaphorically, would prepare him for the greatest and most bizarre waiting game in modern monarchy. Because after decades at sea in the ocean of public life, Charles would finally become king. But his son, Prince William, would inherit something else. Not just the expectation to rule, but the subtle burden of being the modern royal soldier. One who traded ships and desert war zones for coastal rescues and crashing helicopters into the highlands of northern Britain, not for glory, but for the quietly terrifying responsibility of saving lives. 6. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, United Kingdom. Long before the documentaries, the book deals, or the California exile, there was just Captain Wales, a name that sounded like a disguise, but was actually his service identity. In the British Army, where formality meets tradition, Prince Harry didn't lean on his title. Instead, he wore his rank. And in Afghanistan, that mattered more. He joined the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 2005, No exceptions, no gentle glide path. Sandhurst is where grit gets measured in blisters, where the future officers of the British Army learn that heritage doesn't help you on a forced march. He passed, earned his commission as a second lieutenant in the Household Cavalry, specifically the Blues and Royals, and began what would become a rare kind of Royal Military service, one that involved real deployments to real war zones. His first tour came in 2007, Helmand Province. It wasn't public knowledge at the time, intentionally so. The Ministry of Defence and the British press had agreed to keep it under wraps to protect not just Harry, but the entire unit he was embedded with. If word got out that a high-profile royal was in the trenches, he'd become a magnet for enemy forces. For 10 weeks, Harry lived as a forward air controller, coordinating airstrikes and calling in support for troops under fire. When the news finally broke, he was pulled out, reluctantly. Not for his safety, he insisted, but for his comrades. Still, he wasn't done, not even close. A few years later, after retraining as an Apache helicopter co-pilot gunner, Harry returned to Afghanistan in 2012 for a second tour, this time flying combat missions out of Camp Bastion. His squadron operated in the unpredictable, often lawless terrain of Helmand, where the enemy didn't wear uniforms and attacks came from shadows. The Apache was one of the most complex aircraft in the British arsenal, fitted with rockets, Hellfire missiles, and a 30mm chain gun. Flying it wasn't just prestigious, it was lethal. Harry trained hard, earned his qualifications, and logged real combat hours. He wasn't flying sightseeing tours. He was on call to support troops under contact, to provide overwatch, to engage when needed. His fellow soldiers described him as professional, focused, unentitled. To them, he wasn't a tabloid figure. He was just the guy on the radio, the voice in the headset, the pilot keeping their six clear when things went sideways. But Afghanistan left its marks. Years later, Harry would speak candidly about the psychological toll of his service, the numbness, the anger, the confusion of returning home to find that nothing had changed except for you. He channeled that into advocacy, founding the Invictus Games for wounded veterans, supporting mental health initiatives, and trying, however imperfectly, to bridge the vast, awkward gap between civilian life and combat service. Whatever your opinion of Harry now, whether you see him as a wayward prince or a principled exile, his military career stands on its own. 2 tours, real missions, actual leadership. He didn't just wear the uniform, he earned it. And perhaps that's why the military remains the one institution that Harry seems to speak about without irony, without friction. It was the one world where his name wasn't a burden and his presence wasn't a performance. The next royal would also wear the uniform, but not in the dust of the battlefield, rather on the deck of a ship, in the cockpit of a helicopter, commanding not just aircraft, but legacy, not a rebel, a sovereign in waiting, a different kind of service, a different kind of war. 19. Nicholas II, Tsar of Russia. If Peter the Great dragged Russia into the modern military age by sheer force of will, then Nicholas II watched it unravel under the weight of inertia, idealism, and impossible expectations. The last Tsar of Russia didn't just preside over an empire in decline, he marched straight into the heart of its collapse, wearing a general's uniform and carrying the title of Supreme Commander. But uniforms, as history proves time and again, don't guarantee control. Born in 1868, Nicholas was raised in the shadow of rigid tradition. His father, Alexander III, ruled with an iron hand, and Nicholas, sensitive and soft-spoken, seemed ill-suited to follow in it. He was privately educated, heavily sheltered, and trained in military affairs more as a formality than a destiny. Still, like many Romanovs before him, he held military rank from a young age, entering the army in his 20s as a ceremonial officer in the elite Preobrazhensky regiment. He wore the uniform with pride, and he took his training seriously, even if few expected him to ever lead on the battlefield. But history didn't care about expectations. In 1894, Nicholas ascended the throne after his father's sudden death. He was 26. In the beginning, his military role remained largely symbolic, inspecting troops, reviewing regiments, and reinforcing the ceremonial bond between throne and sword. But 2 decades later, when the First World War erupted in 1914, that bond would be tested in ways no Romanov had ever imagined. At first, Nicholas left military command to his generals, but as defeats mounted and morale crumbled, he made a fateful decision. In 1915, he removed his top commander and appointed himself Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces. It was a dramatic gesture, part desperation, part symbolism. Russia needed stability. Nicholas believed his presence at headquarters would inspire the troops and reassert imperial control. Instead, it tethered him to every failure that followed. The Russian military was not a monolith. It was a patchwork, vast, under-equipped, riddled with corruption and logistical failure. Nicholas, stationed at Stavka, the army's high command in Mogilev, had no prior experience commanding such a force. He relied heavily on advisors, many of whom disagreed with each other and with him. Communications with the front were slow, supplies were inconsistent, morale dropped as casualties soared. Meanwhile, with Nicholas at the front, domestic unrest festered back home. Food shortages, inflation, and strikes paralyzed Russian cities. His absence from St. Petersburg, intended as a demonstration of leadership, was seen as detachment. Worse, power unofficially fell to the Tsarina Alexandra and her increasingly controversial confidant, Rasputin. The monarchy began to look less like a bulwark and more like a runaway cart. By early 1917, as the war bled Russia dry and revolution rippled through the streets, Nicholas's command of the army had become politically toxic. His generals, once loyal, began to doubt. His allies faltered, and eventually the impossible happened. The Tsar of all the Russias was asked, then forced, to abdicate. Nicholas II went from supreme commander to prisoner in a matter of weeks. The army he had led disintegrated into factions. The empire he'd sworn to protect dissolved in revolution. And yet, even as a military leader undone by war, Nicholas's service reflects something haunting. The illusion that proximity to power is the same as control. He wore the uniform, carried the burden, and tried to command a storm. The next royal would face his own national crisis, but instead of surrendering to chaos, he would rise in a moment of decisive action. A young king who stood against tyranny not with diplomacy, but with orders that changed the course of his country's allegiance overnight. 18. Peter. Why the Great, Tsar of Russia? Peter the Great did not inherit a military machine. He built one. Brick by brick, keel by keel, cannon by cannon. At a time when Russia was still seen by its Western neighbors as a cold, superstitious backwater, Peter dreamed of a modern empire. But dreams alone don't forge legacies. Armies do, navies do, steel, sweat, strategy, and the will to lead it all himself. Born in 1672, Peter Romanov ascended to the throne as a child and spent his early years surrounded by palace coups, noble intrigues, and the long shadows of boyar politics. But even in youth, he was restless. Obsessed with craftsmanship, science, and ships, he didn't wait for Russia to come to him. He went to Europe instead. In 1697, he disguised himself as a common laborer and travelled incognito through the Dutch Republic and England, studying shipbuilding, artillery, and naval logistics firsthand. He didn't just observe, he worked, hands-on, hammer in hand, the Tsar in a carpenter's apron. This wasn't royal tourism, it was reconnaissance. When he returned to Russia, he launched one of the most ambitious military transformations in European history. The old Russian army was disorganized, semi-feudal, and burdened by outdated tactics. Peter wanted structure. He wanted discipline. He wanted a professional fighting force, not a collection of aristocrats with personal militias. He introduced Western-style drilling, built a centralized command structure, and poured resources into weapons manufacturing and logistics. And then came his real obsession, the sea. Peter knew that without a navy, Russia would never project power beyond its borders. So he built one, essentially from scratch. The first Russian fleet was cobbled together from imported designs, foreign expertise, and sheer imperial will. Shipyards rose along the Don and Neva rivers. He ordered entire cities to be constructed, including St. Petersburg, a city pulled out of swamps by thousands of laborers under imperial decree. It became both a naval base and a political statement. Russia at last would face Europe. His military leadership was not distant or decorative. He led campaigns in person, most famously during the Great Northern War against Sweden, a conflict that would last over 2 decades and reshape the balance of power in Northern Europe. The early years were brutal. At the Battle of Narva in 1700, his army was routed by a much smaller Swedish force under Charles XII, but Peter adapted. He restructured, retrained, and rebuilt. Slowly, the tide turned. In 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, Peter's forces decisively defeated the Swedish army, one of the most disciplined and feared in Europe. It was a personal and national victory. Russia, once laughed off as a lumbering empire of serfs and snow, had just become a military power. And Peter was always there, commanding, inspecting, pushing. He was known to sleep on campaign with the common troops, to personally oversee fortifications, and to join naval expeditions not as a figurehead, but as a working admiral. His body bore the signs of his campaigns: injuries, illnesses, exhaustion. Yet his empire was forged not just by conquest, but by reform. He turned military victory into national identity. Under Peter, Russia stopped looking inward and started thinking imperially. But even iron-willed czars meet resistance they cannot conquer. And the next monarch learned that lesson not through reform, but through retreat. A man who took command of an empire's army in a moment of crisis, only to watch both the army and the empire disintegrate beneath his feet. 17. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary. Before he became the man whose death would trigger a world war, Archduke Franz Ferdinand lived a life defined not by accidents, but by discipline. He wasn't a rebel, he wasn't a revolutionary. He was, above all, a soldier, a product of the Austro-Hungarian Empire's bureaucratic military machine, molded to command and trained to preserve a monarchy already wheezing under the weight of its own contradictions. Born in 1863, Franz Ferdinand wasn't even supposed to inherit the throne. That honor belonged to his cousin, Crown Prince Rudolf, until Rudolf's dramatic death in 1889 left the succession wide open. When Franz Ferdinand's father renounced his claim, the young Archduke suddenly found himself next in line to rule one of Europe's most complicated empires. And he did what many ambitious royals did at the time. He turned to the military. He entered the Austro-Hungarian army young and rose steadily through the ranks, not just by birthright, but by competence. By his early 30s, he was already a general. He wasn't flashy or charismatic. He wasn't loved by the troops, but he was respected for his hard-nosed discipline and intense focus on reform. In an empire where military leadership was often fractured along ethnic and linguistic lines, Franz Ferdinand stood out for his blunt insistence on modernization. His military career wasn't ornamental. He served with active units, learned artillery tactics, and traveled across the empire's far reaches to inspect troops, observe maneuvers, and evaluate readiness. He became Inspector General of the Austro-Hungarian Armed Forces in 1913, second only to the Emperor himself in military authority. It wasn't a decorative post. It meant real control over doctrine, promotion, and long-term planning. And Franz Ferdinand had ideas, plenty of them. He was obsessed with efficiency. He pushed for centralization, modernization of equipment, better officer training, and rational deployment of forces. He believed the empire's survival depended on a more professional army, one less tangled in internal rivalries and more prepared for the conflicts looming on the horizon. He wasn't wrong, but he was resented, especially by the Hungarian political elite who feared his centralizing vision would strip them of their autonomy. And yet, for all his militarism, Franz Ferdinand was not a warmonger. He was wary of Germany. He distrusted the saber-rattling in Vienna. He believed the empire could only survive through internal reform, not external conquest. It's one of history's grim ironies that the man whose assassination would unleash World War I was, privately, a restraining force in foreign policy. He understood war intimately, bureaucratically, and tactically, and perhaps that's why he feared it. On June the 28th, 1914, he travelled to Sarajevo in his capacity as Inspector General. He was there to observe military exercises. It was a working trip, routine in theory. By the end of the day, he would be dead. Along with his wife, their carriage ambushed on the city streets. The shots fired that day didn't just end a life, they ended an age. But before the chaos, before the declarations and the trenches and the barbed wire, Franz Ferdinand was a soldier, a conservative reformer, a man trained to hold an empire together by force and by structure. He failed, not by incompetence, but by history's cruel refusal to wait. And next comes a man who didn't wait either. A Tsar who rode into battle not as a figurehead, but as a commander-in-chief, who seized the reins of a collapsing army, not out of confidence, but out of desperation, and lost everything but his legacy. 16. Ruprecht, Crown Prince of Bavaria. By the time the First World War shattered Europe's illusions of progress, Ruprecht of Bavaria was already a general, but he was more than that. He was a royal with a field command, a strategist with unusual restraint, and a would-be king of a kingdom that would not survive the war he helped fight. In the complex machinery of the German Empire, where Prussian generals often dominated the spotlight, Ruprecht stood apart, not just by title, but by temperament. Born in 1869 into the royal house of Wittelsbach, Ruprecht was heir to the Bavarian throne, a Catholic monarch in waiting in an increasingly Protestant, Prussian-dominated empire. Bavaria had retained a degree of autonomy after German unification, including its own army in times of peace. And Ruprecht, to his credit, didn't treat that army as ceremonial. He trained with it, lived with it, studied military history obsessively. He understood that if the old order was to endure, it had to fight for more than just tradition. It had to fight smart. When war broke out in 1914, Ruprecht was given command of the German Sixth Army on the Western Front. He was no figurehead. His army was responsible for a key sector during the early campaigns in Lorraine, and it was Ruprecht who led German forces through the grinding battles of the war's early years. Attacks and counterattacks in the French borderlands, where the optimism of August 1914 collapsed into mud, trenches, and brutal attrition. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Ruprecht wasn't intoxicated by romantic visions of quick victory. He grasped the industrial horror unfolding before him. He argued, often in vain, for more realistic strategies, more attention to logistics, and fewer suicidal offensives. He criticized Germany's high command, especially General Erich Falkenhayn, for wasting lives on fruitless assaults like those at Verdun. In 1916, he was promoted to command Army Group Ruprecht, responsible for an enormous stretch of the Western Front that included some of the most strategically vital and contested territory in the entire war. He oversaw multiple battles, including key roles in resisting Allied offensives during the Somme and later at Passchendaele. While Germany eventually began to falter under the weight of its own ambitions, Ruprecht's leadership was often cited for its calm clarity, its tactical flexibility, and its rare willingness to question doctrine. And yet, his military career was inseparable from the slow-motion death of the world he represented. As the war dragged on, monarchy after monarchy began to collapse. Russia, Austria-Hungary, eventually Germany itself. When Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated in 1918, the German Empire imploded. The Bavarian monarchy, too, was swept away by revolution. Ruprecht, who might have worn a crown, instead walked into the uncertain republic as a private citizen, his career as a general now preserved only in memory and military records. He spent the rest of his life advocating for constitutional monarchy, but he never returned to political power. His military service, however, remained a benchmark. Not for flashy victories, but for disciplined command during chaos. He was a royal who understood war not as theatre, but as a grim responsibility, a calculation of survival and consequence. And next comes another royal whose name is better known for a gunshot than a command. But make no mistake, before he became history's flashpoint, he was a soldier, an inspector, and a man groomed not for peace, but for order at the barrel of an empire unraveling. 15. Frederick II, the Great, King of Prussia. It's easy to forget that Frederick the Great was once just Frederick the Disappointment. Before the statues, the victories, and the Enlightenment era praise, he was the sensitive, flute-playing, poetry-writing embarrassment of the Prussian royal family, a boy more interested in French philosophy than Prussian drill formations. His father, King Frederick William I, a man made entirely of military routines and distrust, saw his son's gentleness as a weakness, even a threat. Their relationship wasn't strained, it was almost Shakespearean. At one point, Frederick tried to flee the kingdom. His father had his closest friend executed. That set the tone for the rest of his life. But out of that early trauma came something more complex than rebellion. Frederick didn't abandon the military ideals of his father. He absorbed them, refined them, weaponized them. When he became king in 1740, he inherited a small but ruthlessly efficient army, one his father had built obsessively, almost to the point of parody. What Frederick added was strategy, philosophy, ambition, and most dangerously, audacity. Only months into his reign, he invaded Silesia, a rich Austrian province, kicking off the War of the Austrian Succession. The move shocked Europe. Prussia was not supposed to act like a great power, but Frederick didn't care for the etiquette of royal diplomacy. He cared about results, and he got them. The Prussian army under his command moved with terrifying speed and discipline, catching larger forces off balance. It wasn't just battlefield brilliance, it was logistical precision, psychological warfare, and relentless nerve. But he didn't stop with one war. He couldn't. Over the next decades, Frederick would lead his soldiers through a brutal series of conflicts that culminated in the 7 Years' War, a conflict so sprawling it's sometimes called the First World War. Frederick, vastly outnumbered and surrounded by hostile powers, Austria, Russia, France, and eventually Sweden, managed to keep Prussia afloat through sheer force of will. He marched, maneuvered, and outthought armies that should have crushed him. His victories at places like Rossbach and Leuthen became textbook examples of tactical genius. And he didn't just plan battles, he was in them. On horseback, sword at his side, leading charges. He was wounded multiple times. Soldiers often spoke of his coolness under fire, his uncanny ability to read a battlefield like a chessboard. He rode with his troops, shared their hardships, and punished incompetence with cold fury. But this wasn't glory for glory's sake. Frederick wasn't sentimental. War, to him, was a tool, not a calling. He once wrote that a crown is a hat that lets the rain in. And for all his battlefield brilliance, he governed with equal force, reforming Prussian bureaucracy, modernizing the state, and embracing Enlightenment ideals when it suited him. Still, it was his military reputation that defined him. Even Napoleon, no stranger to ego, called Frederick one of the greatest tactical minds in history. His army became the blueprint for German militarism, a legacy both admired and feared for centuries to come. Frederick proved that kings didn't have to be born warriors. They could be forged by pressure, sharpened by failure, and made dangerous by vision. And the next royal in line? He didn't just lead an army, he led entire army groups, commanding men by the millions, in a war that tore the old world apart and rewrote the script of royal military leadership forever. 14. Hussein, King of Jordan. In a region shaped by borders drawn in pencil and erased in blood, King Hussein of Jordan survived where many did not. He ruled for nearly 5 decades through coups, wars, invasions, and the sort of political betrayals that turn monarchs into martyrs. But Hussein was not a figurehead. He was a pilot, a soldier, a king who led not just with speeches, but with stick and throttle. His battlefield wasn't just diplomatic, it was literal. And unlike many sovereigns, he kept his hands on the controls long after power had passed into his. Born in 1935, Hussein ascended the throne in 1952 at the astonishing age of 16, after his father, King Talal, was declared unfit to rule due to mental illness. Thrust into the highest office in the kingdom at an age when most are still figuring out how to park a car, Hussein had no time to ease into leadership. His country bordered enemies and allies alike. His army was under foreign command. His monarchy was fragile. So what did he do? He learned to fly, and not just for sport or spectacle. Hussein was a serious aviator. He trained extensively as a fighter pilot, earning his wings early and building a lifelong identity as both monarch and military man. He flew Hawker Hunters and later F-5s and Mirages, not models in museum hangars, but real aircraft in an active air force. His instructors were often foreign, his peers sometimes skeptical, but he pushed himself hard, because in Jordan, the lines between symbolic service and national survival were dangerously thin. Flying for Hussein was more than a skill, it was a statement. Every takeoff in a jet, every low pass over training grounds, every cockpit photo was part of a broader message to his people and his military. I'm one of you, not above, not apart, but in it. He held the formal rank of Field Marshal in the Jordanian Armed Forces, but what mattered more was his consistent hands-on leadership. He regularly visited training exercises, led command briefings, and took personal interest in defense strategy. He reorganized and modernized the military, expanding Jordan's capacity for independent defense and reducing its reliance on outside powers. His relationship with the armed forces wasn't ceremonial, it was paternal. During the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1970 Black September conflict, Hussein was not a distant figure behind palace walls. He was in uniform, in country, making real-time decisions with geopolitical stakes. Even when controversial or unpopular, he stayed in the thick of it. He coordinated directly with foreign powers, walked among his officers, and kept Jordan intact when others predicted its collapse. But perhaps the most defining image of Hussein isn't at a peace table or in a war room, but in the air, headset on, flying over the kingdom he ruled with both anxiety and affection. Flying was how he cleared his mind. It was where he felt most free and perhaps, paradoxically, most grounded. Hussein never led with bombast. His authority came from endurance, and his military service reflected that. Even toward the end of his life, battling illness, he continued to engage with his officers, inspect troops, and attend drills. To him, service wasn't a chapter, it was the frame. And after Hussein came a king who knew all too well the price of war, but from another angle. A man who rose not to reign, but to command from the trenches of a war that tore empires apart. A soldier by birthright, but also by brutal necessity. 13. Abdullah II, King of Jordan. If there's a royal whose military credentials feel less like a chapter and more like a spine running through his entire identity, it's King Abdullah II of Jordan. Born into a throne surrounded by geopolitical tension and historical fragility, Abdullah didn't inherit stability. He inherited volatility. But instead of leaning on diplomacy alone, he took a different path. He trained to fight. He led from the front. And in the process, he became one of the rare monarchs whose military resume could go toe-to-toe with that of any career officer. Born in 1962 to King Hussein and Princess Muna, Abdullah grew up knowing that survival in Jordan wasn't something that could be assumed. It had to be earned. His father, King Hussein, had already survived multiple assassination attempts, 2 major wars, and decades of Cold War proxy balancing. Abdullah's generation wasn't promised peace. It was trained for pressure. After attending prep school in the UK and the United States, Abdullah enrolled at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in 1980, the same legendary institution that shaped generations of British officers and more than a few royals. But unlike many aristocratic trainees who pass through for appearance's sake, Abdullah took to Sandhurst with complete immersion. He then joined the British Army as a second lieutenant in the 13th 18th Royal Hussars, serving in West Germany during the Cold War. After completing his UK-based commission, he returned to Jordan and began his ascent through the ranks of the Jordanian Armed Forces. Over the next 2 decades, he would train, lead, and innovate in a military that was often Jordan's last line of stability amid regional chaos. He graduated from Georgetown School of Foreign Service, attended advanced military courses in the US, and trained as a helicopter pilot and paratrooper. He wasn't collecting badges, he was building capability. But the crown jewel of his service came in the form of Jordan's Special Forces. In the 1990s, Abdullah took command of the country's elite 40th Armored Brigade, then its Special Forces Command, and eventually led a major restructuring of Jordan's special operations. He didn't just occupy the office, he reformed the institution. He introduced new training doctrines, pushed modernization, and emphasized intelligence and counter-terrorism capabilities. Under his command, the Jordanian SOF went from elite in name to elite in function, well respected by international counterparts, especially in the US and UK. His leadership was never just about tactics, it was about credibility. In a region plagued by coups, dynasties, and performative leadership, Abdullah stood out as a monarch who'd actually run live operations, who'd commanded in the field, who had both the classroom and combat resume. When he ascended the throne in 1999 following his father's death, the military didn't just salute out of protocol, it saluted out of respect. To this day, Abdullah remains closely involved in defense affairs, often seen in military attire, not for nostalgia, but because he speaks the language. He understands operational briefs, chain of command nuances, and the stakes of regional conflict not as a diplomat, but as a soldier. And up next is the man who set the example before him, his own father, the original warrior king of modern Jordan. A monarch who flew planes before meetings, who led from cockpits and command centers alike, and who proved that sometimes survival isn't enough. Sometimes you fight to redefine the battlefield itself. 27. Vajiralongkorn, Rama X, King of Thailand. Before he was King Rama X, before the coronation robes and palace intrigue, Vajiralongkorn was a soldier in flight, a trained pilot, a career officer, a man shaped by Thailand's military academies and the chaos of Southeast Asia's post-colonial wars. His reign may have invited scrutiny for its secrecy and controversy, but his military record, though less celebrated, was grounded, structured, and very real. Born in 1952 as the only son of King Bhumibol Adulyadej and Queen Sirikit, Vajiralongkorn was raised in a royal household deeply intertwined with Thailand's armed forces. His father, Rama IX, had weathered coups, assassinations, and Cold War realignments, and the message was clear. The monarchy would survive not by mystique alone, but through alignment with power, particularly the military. Vajiralongkorn was educated abroad, attending schools in the United Kingdom and Australia. But it was at the Royal Military College, Duntroon, Australia's equivalent of West Point, that his career in uniform took shape. He graduated in 1976 as a commissioned officer, having completed intensive courses in leadership, field tactics, and military ethics. From there, his path led back to Thailand, where he entered the Royal Thai Army and began rising through its ranks, not solely by birthright, but by embedded training. His military education didn't stop at Duntroon. He completed courses in jungle warfare, advanced infantry tactics, and unconventional operations. He also trained with US and British forces, immersing himself in airborne and special operations environments. This wasn't a case of parading through drills. Vajiralongkorn pushed for full qualifications, earning his wings as both a fighter pilot and a helicopter commander. During the 1970s and early 1980s, Thailand was grappling with communist insurgencies, particularly in the rural north and northeast. While Vajiralongkorn was not deployed as a frontline field commander in the conventional sense, he did take part in operational flights and exercises tied to these counterinsurgency efforts. Military records and public accounts confirm that he flew both fixed-wing and rotary aircraft on surveillance and supply missions, sometimes in contested zones. In particular, he flew F-5 fighter jets and UH-1 helicopters, aircraft that were actively used during Thailand's security campaigns of the era. He was promoted steadily, ultimately reaching the rank of general in the army, admiral in the navy, and Air Chief Marshal in the Air Force. These titles, while ceremonial at the highest level, were underpinned by genuine time in the cockpit and the command room. Within the Thai armed forces, he cultivated strong relationships, especially within the army's upper echelons. His public appearances in uniform, even as Crown Prince, were more than symbolic. They reinforced a deeper truth. The monarchy and the military in Thailand were not separate institutions. They were codependent pillars of the state. When he ascended the throne in 2016, those military ties formed the backbone of his reign. One of his first moves as king was to take direct control of key army units, bringing elite guard regiments under royal command, bypassing the usual chain of command. It was a consolidation of power that echoed his earlier years, precise, forceful, and grounded in his lifelong alignment with military authority. Vajiralongkorn's military career didn't define him publicly in the way other monarchs are remembered for their heroics, but in Thailand, where uniformed power has toppled governments and rewritten constitutions, it placed him exactly where he needed to be, inside the structure that holds up the entire kingdom. Next comes a warrior king from centuries earlier, where the battlefield wasn't a constitutional chessboard, but a literal fight for national survival. A man who led armies by sword, liberated his people, and carved a name into history not with law, but with fire and steel. 26. Jan III, Sobieski, King of Poland-Lithuania. Some monarchs rule by bloodline, others by bureaucracy. Jan III Sobieski ruled by force of will and sheer audacity. A scholar turned soldier turned savior, he rose through the ranks not because of noble birth, but because every time Poland was in danger, he was the one riding towards the sound of cannon fire. And in 1683, with the fate of Christian Europe hanging in the balance, Sobieski didn't just show up. He led the largest cavalry charge in history and changed the course of an empire overnight. Born in 1629 into the Polish nobility, Sobieski was well educated, fluent in several languages, deeply versed in history, mathematics, and military science. But his classroom was soon replaced by a battlefield. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of his youth was a kingdom in slow decline, beset by external threats and internal squabbles. Sweden, the Cossacks, the Ottomans, and Russia all tested its borders. Sobieski didn't just study strategy, he lived it. He began his military career in the 1640s and quickly made a name for himself. His mind was as sharp as his sword. He mastered both Eastern and Western tactics, learning from Tatar cavalry raids and Swedish infantry maneuvers. By the 1660s, he was one of Poland's most trusted commanders. His victories against the Ottomans in the southern frontiers made him a national hero. In 1674, he was elected king, not as a formality, but as a field-tested general beloved by both soldiers and citizens. But Sobieski's greatest moment came nearly a decade later. In 1683, the Ottoman Empire launched its most ambitious European campaign in over a century, the Siege of Vienna. With over 100,000 troops, the Ottomans surrounded the Habsburg capital, threatening to break into Central Europe. The Holy Roman Emperor fled the city. Panic spread across the continent, and while many debated, negotiated, or prayed, Sobieski marched. He led a coalition of Polish, Austrian, and German forces, an uneasy alliance with conflicting interests but a shared enemy. His army, though smaller, moved with stunning speed. He crossed the Carpathian Mountains in record time, arriving near Vienna in September. On September 12, 1683, Sobieski launched a coordinated assault on the besieging Ottoman army. The battle raged for hours. Then, in the late afternoon, Sobieski led a charge of 18,000 cavalry, among them the legendary winged hussars, Poland's shock troops clad in armor with towering feathered wings that thundered down the hills like a myth in motion. The charge smashed through the Ottoman lines and broke the siege. Vienna was saved. The Ottoman expansion into Central Europe was halted, and Jan Sobieski was immortalized not just as a warrior, but as a protector of Christendom. But Sobieski wasn't a warmonger. After Vienna, he advocated for peace. He understood that victory, if left unguarded by diplomacy, would eventually erode. Yet despite his triumph, his homeland continued its long, slow unraveling. Poland would survive Sobieski, but not indefinitely. Still, his ride down the slopes of the Kahlenberg remains one of history's most decisive battlefield moments. A king who didn't just order men into war, but charged with them into the teeth of an empire. And next comes a royal not of Europe, but of Asia, one who flew fighter jets, served with commandos, and didn't just inherit a kingdom, but shaped it from cockpit to command post in a time when insurgents, not empires, threatened the throne. 25. Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden. If there was ever a king who treated the battlefield like a laboratory, it was Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. He didn't just command troops, he rewired how warfare was fought in Europe. Part reformer, part warrior, and part myth in the making, Gustavus rose in the early 17th century during a time when Sweden was still an emerging power tucked in the frozen shadows of Europe's great empires. By the time he was done, Sweden was a military force to be reckoned with, and he was known as the Lion of the North. Born in 1594 and crowned at the young age of 17, Gustavus didn't waste time testing the waters of kingship. He took command of a kingdom constantly threatened by Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. But instead of simply reacting, he reimagined. Sweden's army, though small, became one of the most modern in Europe thanks to his innovations. He reorganized logistics, introduced combined arms tactics, and prioritized mobility over brute force, a stark contrast to the lumbering mercenary armies of the day. His reforms weren't theoretical. He tested them in battle. Early on, he fought wars against Russia and Poland, proving that discipline and mobility could compensate for numerical inferiority. He emphasized the use of smaller, more maneuverable regiments, intermixing infantry with cavalry and artillery, creating flexible formations that could react faster and strike harder than the traditional densely packed squares of his enemies. But Gustavus's defining moment came during the 30 Years' War, a sprawling, chaotic conflict that consumed Central Europe from 1618 to 1648. It began as a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, but like most wars of ideology, it quickly turned into a competition for power and influence. In 1630, Gustavus landed in northern Germany with a clear goal: to defend Protestant interests and expand Sweden's strategic influence on the continent. But his arrival didn't just shift alliances, it changed the pace and logic of the war itself. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Gustavus's forces clashed with the Catholic League under Count Tilly. The result was a revelation. Using rapid troop movements, coordinated firepower, and disciplined timing, Gustavus routed the enemy, turning the tide of the war and proving that his military doctrine could outclass even the most entrenched Catholic forces. His combination of muskets and artillery created a rhythm of battle never seen before, precise, relentless, and lethal. His legend only grew after Breitenfeld. He marched south, winning more engagements, drawing admiration from Protestant allies, and grudging respect from Catholic foes. But in 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen, the arc of his brilliance met its end. Though the Swedes won the battle, Gustavus led a cavalry charge in heavy fog and was killed in the fighting. His body was found stripped and pierced, but the army pressed on, driven by the doctrine and discipline he had instilled. Even in death, Gustavus's influence rippled through military history. His strategies would inspire future commanders like Napoleon and Frederick the Great. He didn't just fight wars, he changed how wars were fought. He proved that brains could beat brawn, and that reform wasn't weakness, it was a weapon, and the next royal to take the field would wield that weapon too, charged not just with saving his own kingdom, but with halting an empire. A warrior king who rode not for conquest but for salvation, and left behind a legacy as sharp as the saber he carried into battle. 24. Suleiman the Magnificent, Ottoman Sultan. To the Western world, he was the Magnificent. To his own people, he was Kanuni, the lawgiver. But beyond the gilded titles and architectural legacies, Suleiman I was, at his core, a warrior. A soldier emperor who believed that power wasn't proven by how far you sat from the battlefield, but by how close you were to it. And during his 46-year reign, he didn't just shape laws, palaces, and poetry. He led armies, personally, directly, and often from horseback. Born in 1494, Suleiman inherited the Ottoman throne in 1520 at age 26. The empire was already expansive, but its military strength, though formidable, had plateaued. That changed almost immediately under his rule. Unlike monarchs who governed from marble halls, Suleiman believed that to legitimize rule, a sultan had to ride into war. In Ottoman tradition, the image of the warrior sultan was more than symbolic. It was central to the idea of just and divine authority. And so he led. His first campaign took him to Belgrade in 1521. The fortress city was a strategic thorn in the Ottoman side, well defended and a symbol of Christian resistance. Suleiman didn't delegate its conquest to his generals. He camped with his troops, oversaw siege operations, and after a prolonged assault took the city. A year later, he marched west again, this time to the island of Rhodes, launching a brutal siege against the Knights Hospitaller. After months of combat and negotiations, the Ottomans emerged victorious. Suleiman had opened his reign not with ceremonies, but with conquests. But the defining moment came in 1526 at the Battle of Mohacs. Facing the Kingdom of Hungary, Suleiman's forces obliterated the opposing army in a single devastating encounter. The battle lasted less than 2 hours. The Hungarian king died on the field. The result? Hungary collapsed and Ottoman influence surged deep into Central Europe. Again, Suleiman was there, commanding, observing, adapting. He understood logistics, terrain, and the psychological weight of speed. His battlefield presence wasn't ornamental, it was operational, and he didn't stop. His campaigns stretched from the gates of Vienna in the west to the deserts of Iraq in the east. He fought the Safavids, the Mamluks, and the Habsburgs. On land and at sea, the Ottoman military machine under his reign became the most feared in the world. Yet he wasn't a conqueror for conquest's sake. He governed the territories he took. He fortified borders. He standardized laws and tax systems across diverse provinces. His military mind was matched by his administrative reforms. Still, Suleiman's wars weren't always triumphant. His 1529 siege of Vienna failed, halted by weather, logistics, and sheer resistance. But even in retreat, his reputation grew. He had taken the Ottoman banner farther west than any before him, and forced the powers of Europe to recognize him not as a barbarian invader, but as an peace emperor of equal weight. He led his final campaign in 1566 at the age of 72 against the fortress of Szigetvar in Hungary. Sick and dying, he remained in the field until his last breath, his death kept secret from his troops until the battle was won. Suleiman wasn't just a military monarch, he was the blueprint, a sovereign whose presence in war defined the battlefield, a leader who wrote poetry by night and battle orders by dawn. His shadow stretched across continents, not just because of what he built, but because of where he rode. And next, we ride north into the cold forests of Europe, where another king, younger, bolder, and armed with revolutionary tactics, would carve his legend not in gold, but in gunpowder. 23. Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia. If monarchy is theatre, then Haile Selassie played his role with unmatched conviction, robes heavy with history, eyes sharp with memory, and a will steeled by occupation. But beneath the ceremonial grandeur stood a soldier king, not in title alone, but in temperament. Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, faced one of the 20th century's earliest and most brutal tests of military leadership, the Italian invasion of his homeland in 1935. He did not win on the battlefield, but he did not surrender either. Born to Fari Makonnen in 1892, he was no stranger to the discipline of empire. His rise through Ethiopia's aristocracy was rooted in political cunning and administrative competence. By the time he was crowned emperor in 1930, Haile Selassie had already served as regent, modernized segments of the government, and began reforming the Ethiopian military, an institution still dependent on regional lords and outdated logistics. But reforms take time, and Mussolini did not wait. In October 1935, fascist Italy launched a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia. It was a colonial war disguised as revenge for Italy's humiliating defeat at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This time, the Italians came with tanks, aircraft, and chemical weapons. Ethiopia came with horses, outdated rifles, and decentralized command structures. The outcome was never going to be fair. But Haile Selassie didn't flinch. He took to the front in the northern theatre of war, donning a military uniform and joining his commanders on the battlefield. He wasn't a tactician in the modern sense. His generalship was grounded more in symbolism and morale. But his presence rallied troops. His command post near the front line wasn't a formality. He moved with the army, observed movements, and issued direct orders. His son, Crown Prince Asfar Wasson, also served. This was not a war fought from a palace. Still, courage couldn't overcome the technological gap. After months of grueling resistance and staggering losses, the capital of Addis Ababa fell. Haile Selassie went into exile in 1936, not in shame, but in strategy. He carried his resistance to the League of Nations, delivering a now famous speech in Geneva. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow," he warned. The world clapped, then looked away. But Haile Selassie did not wait for sympathy. He waited for opportunity. With the outbreak of World War II, fortunes shifted. British forces, with Ethiopian support, launched the East African Campaign in 1940. By early 1941, Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia, this time not as a fugitive monarch but as a rallying symbol for national liberation. He re-entered the country through Sudan, joining allied forces and local resistance fighters. It wasn't a triumphant military comeback, but a strategic one. Within months, Italian forces surrendered and Haile Selassie was restored to his throne. He spent the rest of his reign wrestling with modernization, Cold War politics, and domestic unrest. But he never shed the imprint of military service. His leadership was rooted in a soldier's endurance: lose ground, regroup, return. Haile Selassie's uniform didn't guarantee victory, but it meant something. In a century that saw empires fall and tyrants rise, he stood as a reminder that some monarchs still marched with their men and came back for them. And next, we leave the hills of Ethiopia and turn towards the tented battlefields of empire, where another ruler, centuries earlier, also led from the front. A conqueror whose name still echoes across continents. A warrior emperor whose very presence on the battlefield changed the fate of entire regions. 22. Rainier III, Prince of Monaco. Long before he became the world's most photographed sovereign, married to a Hollywood starlet and ruling over Europe's glitziest postage stamp, Rainier III of Monaco was just another young man in uniform. Not born into excess, but into uncertainty. Not born to playboy myth, but to post-war fracture. And before he ever ruled a principality known more for yachts than tanks, he served in a war that had none of Monaco's sparkle, only the cold arithmetic of survival. Born in 1923, Rainier Louis-Henri Maxence Bertrand Grimaldi was a student when World War II consumed Europe. Monaco, nestled like a jeweled pebble on the French Riviera, tried to stay neutral, but neutrality had its limits. The Italian occupation came first, then German forces swept in. By 1942, the tiny principality was under Nazi control, its supposed independence little more than a rumor. For a young prince watching his homeland buckle under occupation, waiting it out wasn't an option. Service was. In 1943, Rainier joined the Free French Army. He could have claimed neutrality or found a diplomatic corner to hide in, as some royals did. Instead, he enlisted in an active fighting force, at a time when the outcome of the war was still uncertain. The Free French were a patchwork of loyalists, exiles, escapees, soldiers who had fled the Vichy regime, and Rainier became one of them, training not as a symbolic mascot, but as an actual officer. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant and served with distinction in the 7th Infantry Regiment. His service was real, not decorative. As the Allies pushed north through France in the wake of D-Day, Rainier saw combat in Alsace and the German Rhineland during the winter of 1944-45. The terrain was frozen, the resistance was fierce, and the frontline conditions were brutal. This wasn't palace pageantry. This was slogging through snow-covered fields, trying to hold fractured lines as the last desperate months of the Third Reich played out. His performance earned recognition. He was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Bronze Star and later received the rank of captain. These honors weren't handed to him for his title. They were earned the hard way, through field duty, discipline, and quiet resolve. His wartime experience shaped him. He returned from the war not with grandeur, but with gravity, and gravity would serve him well. When his grandfather, Prince Louis II, died in 1949, Rainier became sovereign Prince of Monaco at the age of 25. The country he inherited was fragile. War and occupation had scarred its infrastructure and drained its economy. The casino was struggling, the principality's famed glamour was threadbare. But Rainier, shaped by military precision and wartime realism, approached his reign with discipline. He modernized Monaco's constitution, diversified its economy, and cleaned up its reputation. He became the soldier-turned-statesman of Europe's smallest monarchy. And while the police world remembers the photos with Grace Kelly, the yachts, the Monte Carlo sunsets, Rainier never quite shed the soldier's instinct. Order, resilience, readiness, these weren't just governing principles, they were muscle memory. And next comes a royal whose battlefield wasn't Europe, it was Africa. A sovereign who watched his empire be invaded, stood in the dust of betrayal, and returned not just to reclaim his throne, but to fight for his nation's soul. 21. Peter II, King of Yugoslavia. Peter II was a king without a kingdom before he could legally drive a car. Crowned at age 11, exiled at 17, and dead at 47, his life played out like a geopolitical tragedy, one punctuated by war, exile, and a uniform borrowed from a foreign air force. He didn't command armies, he didn't win wars, but he flew, he served, and in doing so, tried to stitch together a sense of purpose when history had already torn his world apart. Born in 1923, Peter became King of Yugoslavia in 1934, after his father, King Alexander I, was assassinated in Marseille during a state visit. Too young to rule in his own right, a regency was established under his uncle, Prince Paul. For a while, Yugoslavia walked a precarious diplomatic tightrope in Europe's pre-war storm, caught between the demands of Nazi Germany, the ambitions of Mussolini, and its own internal divisions. Prince Paul eventually aligned with the Axis under duress in March 1941, attempting to preserve Yugoslav sovereignty, but the people and the military saw it differently. Just days later, a British-supported coup d'etat erupted in Belgrade. Prince Paul was deposed, and 17-year-old Peter II was declared of age. Overnight, he went from teenage figurehead to the sole face of a fragile kingdom. The world, however, didn't wait for him to catch up. Within weeks, Hitler launched a full-scale invasion of Yugoslavia. The royal government fled. The monarchy went into exile. The country fractured into resistance groups, puppet states, and civil war. By the time Peter landed in London, he was a king in theory only. But unlike some exiled royals content to await restoration from a drawing room, Peter tried to contribute in any way he could. And so, in 1942, he joined the Royal Air Force, one of the few options left open to him in a world where titles carried little currency. It wasn't a ceremonial appointment. He trained formally, passed courses, and flew missions in a non-combat role, primarily involving ferrying aircraft and conducting liaison duties. Flight was, perhaps, the only space in which he still had control. In the air, he wasn't King Peter II. He was just another young man in uniform, one who had lost his homeland, his authority, and the monarchy itself, but not his sense of obligation. Back in Yugoslavia, his once loyal army had splintered into factions. The royalist Chetniks and the communist partisans vied for control, and the Allies, seeing more effectiveness in Tito's partisans, shifted their support. By 1945, the monarchy was abolished. A republic was declared. Peter II was now not just exiled, but unemployed by history. He would never return to power. The rest of his life was spent in relative obscurity, mostly in the United States, burdened by poor health, financial instability, and the kind of quiet grief that comes from being erased by history while still alive. But his RAF service stood apart. It was brief but real. Not a pageant, not a headline, just a displaced king choosing to serve someone else's country when his own was gone. And next comes a prince who fought not with dynasties behind him, but with the dust of occupied Europe on his boots. A royal who wore French colours, marched in real combat, and later ruled a micro-state with a soldier's eye and a survivor's memory. 20. Michael I, King of Romania. Michael I was a king twice, but a child the first time and an exile the second. Sandwiched between dictatorships, royal coups and foreign occupation, his reign was less about ceremony and more about survival. Yet in one rare, decisive moment, he wielded his authority with surgical precision and did something few monarchs in history ever manage. He ended a war for his country mid-battle with a single order. Born in 1921 to King Carol II and Queen Eleanor of Greece, Michael was first crowned at the age of 6 after his father's abdication. It was a reign in name only, symbolic and short-lived. When Carol II returned to power in 1930, Michael was demoted to Crown Prince, his role reduced to state appearances and polite nods at parades. But history had other plans. In 1940, as Europe was plunging deeper into the chaos of World War II, Carol II was forced to abdicate again. This time, Michael became king under vastly more dangerous circumstances. Romania was being carved up by neighboring powers, Soviets in the east, Hungarians in the north, and the looming threat of Nazi Germany everywhere else. The military dictatorship of General Ion Antonescu soon took control, and though Michael remained king in title, real power belonged to Antonescu and his alliance with Hitler. Michael was sidelined, his movements monitored, his speeches ghost-written, but he watched quietly as Romania became more deeply entangled in the Axis war effort. Romanian troops were sent to fight alongside the Germans on the Eastern Front, especially during the disastrous Stalingrad campaign, where they suffered massive losses. The country's resources were drained, and its sovereignty was a shell. By 1944, with the tide of war turning and Soviet forces advancing toward Romania's borders, Michael made his move. On August the 23rd, in a plan so secret that even many of his own advisors were unaware, King Michael summoned Antonescu to the royal palace under the pretense of consultation. Once inside, Antonescu was presented with a demand: sign an armistice with the Allies, or be removed from power. When he refused, Michael had him arrested by royal guards, effectively staging a bloodless coup. Within hours, the king announced over the radio that Romania had changed sides. The country exited its alliance with Nazi Germany and joined the Allies. German troops still stationed in Romania were suddenly enemies, and Soviet forces were welcomed in as liberators. A strange, uneasy welcome that would carry its own consequences. The coup drastically shortened the war in Eastern Europe, likely saving tens of thousands of Romanian and Soviet lives. Churchill and Roosevelt praised the action. Stalin smiled and then made his own plans. Though the war ended with Michael hailed briefly as a hero, the post-war period saw Romania fall behind the Iron Curtain. Soviet-backed communists gradually took control. In 1947, under intense pressure from Moscow and the Romanian Communist Party, Michael was forced to abdicate at gunpoint and sent into exile. His act of defiance, reclaiming control from a dictatorship, redirecting the course of a nation in a single day, remained the most significant moment of his reign. He would live most of the rest of his life abroad, returning only decades later after communism collapsed. Michael's military leadership didn't come through battlefield command or long campaigns. It came in one sharp, morally grounded decision, made in the narrow space between two empires. And next comes another exiled monarch, one who wore wings instead of a crown, and who, though cut off from his homeland, found his own way to fight from the sky above another nation's war. 30. Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, UAE President, Abu Dhabi ruler. In the shimmering glass and steel skyline of Abu Dhabi, it's easy to forget that the United Arab Emirates is a very recent invention. Just decades ago, it was a federation of desert principalities held together by shared lineage, cautious diplomacy, and an oil-fueled sprint toward modernity. In that volatile terrain, between tradition and transformation, rose Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, better known as MBZ. Today, he is president of the UAE, ruler of Abu Dhabi, and arguably one of the most influential military minds in the Middle East. But long before the geopolitical calculus, there was a uniform, a flight helmet, and a Sandhurst education. Born in 1961, Mohammed bin Zayed grew up in the shadow of his father, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, the founding father of the UAE. From early on, he was not just expected to inherit power, but to earn it. That process began overseas at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in the United Kingdom, where MBZ trained alongside other future leaders of Gulf monarchies. There, discipline wasn't a formality, it was a daily ritual. He studied battlefield tactics, small unit leadership, and international defense systems. It was rigorous, and it shaped him. Graduating in 1979, he returned home with more than a degree. He brought with him a worldview, one grounded in military realism, chain of command, and systems thinking. He immediately joined the UAE Armed Forces and rose through the ranks, not merely by virtue of family, but by operational aptitude. He trained as a helicopter pilot, logging hours in combat helicopters such as the French-built Gazelle. He also became qualified in fixed-wing aircraft and was certified as a fighter pilot, reportedly flying F-16s and Mirage jets during his early years. His real influence, however, emerged not in the cockpit but in the command center. In the 1990s, MBZ began reshaping the UAE's military strategy, pushing it from a loosely organized defense force into a modern, Western-trained and highly mobile army. His approach was pragmatic and focused: recruit international expertise, invest in elite training, and develop rapid deployment capability. He encouraged close military ties with the United States and France, participated in joint exercises, and gradually shifted the military's doctrine toward readiness, not just ceremony. Under his leadership, the UAE didn't just buy advanced weaponry, it trained to use it. Emirati troops participated in operations in Kosovo, Somalia, Libya, and Yemen. In 2015, the UAE became a core member of the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, deploying ground forces, special operations units, and air assets. While the campaign drew controversy, there was little doubt about the professionalism and effectiveness of the Emirati military machine, one MBZ had spent decades engineering. But perhaps his most understated military achievement has been in the realm of deterrence. The UAE, despite its small size, now possesses one of the most advanced armed forces in the region. Its soldiers are trained abroad, its leadership is deeply integrated with NATO allies, and its defense sector continues to evolve, often under MBZ's direct oversight. Today, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed still holds the position of Supreme Commander of the UAE Armed Forces. His presence at military academies, defense expos, and strategic war games isn't ornamental, it's operational. He governs like a strategist, balancing diplomacy with readiness, tradition with transformation. And though he no longer flies helicopters across the desert, the pilot's mindset remains: scan the horizon, act decisively, and never forget that altitude doesn't guarantee safety. It only gives you the advantage to see further, plan faster, and respond first. With him, the long arc of military royalty comes full circle. From ancient warrior kings to modern commanders-in-chief, these 30 royals remind us that sometimes the crown weighs less than the uniform and lasts longer only if it's earned. 29. Qaboos bin Said, Sultan of Oman. Not every monarch begins his reign with a coup, and fewer still orchestrate it against their own father. But Qaboos bin Said wasn't interested in ruling for tradition's sake. He was interested in pulling his country out of the past, one boot, one policy, one regiment at a time. Before he was Oman's longest reigning ruler, Qaboos was a soldier, trained in the British military tradition, armed with a Sandhurst education and the kind of calm precision that doesn't shout authority, it quietly assumes it. Born in 1940, Qaboos was educated in India and later at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst in the United Kingdom, where young officers from across the former empire were still shaped by British doctrine, discipline, and a distinct emphasis on order. He wasn't just ticking royal boxes, he completed the full officer training course, commissioning into the British Army. After Sandhurst, he served with a British infantry battalion in West Germany during the Cold War, gaining hands-on experience in NATO operations at a time when Europe sat on the edge of a potential East-West eruption. But it wasn't Europe he was training for. It was home. When Qaboos returned to Oman in the 1960s, he found a country sealed off from the modern world. Under the rule of his father, Sultan Saeed bin Taimur, Oman had no television, no newspapers, and barely any infrastructure. The armed forces were small, underfunded, and fractured. Civil unrest was rising, especially in Dhofar, the southern province that had become a breeding ground for Marxist insurgency. The Sultan's response was repression and isolation. Qaboos saw the writing on the wall, and in 1970, with the quiet backing of the British, he overthrew his father in a palace coup. It was almost bloodless. His father was exiled to London, and Qaboos took the throne not with grand speeches, but with a singular focus: modernization. His military training wasn't just a background footnote, it became the blueprint for rebuilding Oman from the ground up. The Dhofar rebellion became his first real test. A communist insurgency supported by South Yemen and Soviet-aligned states, the conflict threatened to split the country apart. Qaboos didn't just send troops, he joined them. Wearing the uniform of Supreme Commander, he visited frontline units, flew in military helicopters, and built morale from within. With British Special Forces and Iranian troops supporting him, he initiated a multi-pronged strategy: military offensives to retake territory, infrastructure projects to win local support, and amnesty programs to peel fighters away from the insurgency. By 1976, the rebellion was crushed, not just through force, but through a counter-insurgency strategy that blended warfare with governance, something Qaboos understood from both his military training and his political instincts. Over the decades, he transformed the Sultan's armed forces into one of the most respected in the Gulf region. He invested heavily in officer education, military hardware, and international partnerships. Under his command, Oman remained neutral, stable, and surprisingly independent in a region marked by volatility and alliances of convenience. Qaboos rarely gave interviews. He didn't grandstand, but when he appeared in uniform, crisp, measured, reserved, it wasn't just ceremonial. It was a reminder that Oman's transformation came not from outside pressure, but from within. From a soldier who studied the world abroad, returned to a nation stuck in time, and led it, patiently, deliberately, into the modern era. And finally, we arrive in the present, to a royal who didn't just follow the path of military service, but used it to climb the ranks of his nation's power structure. A leader trained in the British mold, piloting fighter jets over desert skies and rising through strategy, not accident, to command not just armed forces, but a federation. 28. Narasuan, King of Ayutthaya Siam. In the historical imagination of Thailand, King Narasuan isn't just remembered, he's revered. He's not portrayed as a distant ruler seated on a throne, but as a warrior on horseback, charging into battle, blade drawn, face locked with his enemy. He led from the front, he fought for independence, and in an age when empires expanded with muskets and treaties, Narasuan carved sovereignty out of steel and determination. Born in 1555 into the royal family of the Ayutthaya Kingdom, then Siam, Narasuan's early life was shaped by a hostage exchange, common diplomatic currency in the region at the time. As a young prince, he was taken to the Burmese court at Pegu, following Ayutthaya's submission to Burma under King Bayanaung. There, he was raised not as a prisoner, but as a royal guest, yet the political undertone was unmistakable. He was leverage. The message was clear. Siam was not free, but this experience, rather than breaking him, forged him. At the Burmese court, he studied warfare, politics, and military customs. He learned the strengths and weaknesses of his future enemies firsthand, and when he was finally allowed to return home, he brought with him more than just experience. He brought a resolve to end Burmese domination once and for all. At the age of 16, Naresuan was appointed Uparaja, essentially the crown prince and viceroy of Phitsanulok, a key northern province. By 20, he was leading military campaigns, pushing back against regional threats and slowly building his reputation as a fearless, decisive commander. The turning point came in 1584, when the Burmese monarchy was destabilized by internal strife. Naresuan seized the moment. He openly declared Siam's independence from Burma, defying one of the most powerful empires in the region. What followed was a string of battles that would define his reign and his legend. Over the next 2 decades, Naresuan led campaign after campaign to secure and defend Siamese autonomy. He didn't just issue orders, he fought personally. His military leadership was direct, mobile, and fiercely aggressive. He emphasized quick strikes, superior positioning, and relentless pursuit. His army wasn't large by regional standards, but under his command, it became one of the most respected fighting forces in Southeast Asia. His most famous moment came in 1593 at the legendary Elephant Battle of Nong Sarai, where Naresuan, mounted on war elephant, challenged the Burmese crown prince to single combat. In the stylized traditions of Southeast Asian warfare, this was both symbolic and strategic. Victory would deal a fatal blow to Burmese morale. In full view of both armies, Naresuan killed his rival, an act that turned him into a mythic figure and secured his place as one of Thailand's most iconic monarchs. He continued to campaign into the late 1590s, expanding Siamese influence across the region, from Cambodia to the Malay Peninsula. But he wasn't just a conqueror, he was a consolidator. He restructured the army, improved fortifications, and maintained the independence he had fought so hard to win. Naresuan died in 1605 during yet another campaign, reportedly from illness. He died as he lived, on the move, in service, in command. His legacy, however, never faded. Today, he's remembered in statues, films, and national holidays. In Thai history, he is not just a king, he is a liberator. And from the jungles of Southeast Asia, we now cross deserts and mountains to a different kind of monarch. One trained in the West, born into tradition, and tasked with building, not just defending, a modern army capable of holding a volatile region together.